She arrived early that morning, long before the crowd filled the hallway outside the audition room. She carried her old keyboard in both hands, the weight pulling her shoulders down, though she didn't seem to notice. To anyone passing by, she looked like any other quiet teenager hoping for a chance on stage. But inside, her heart was beating faster than she wanted to admit. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the feeling of wanting something so badly that it almost hurt. The building was louder than she expected. Contestants laughed in groups, warming up their voices or adjusting their outfits. Some talked boldly about how they were going to impress the judges, while others paced back and forth, whispering memorized lines or humming melodies. She didn't have anyone with her, so she stood near the wall with her keyboard at her feet, watching everything around her. She felt a bit invisible, but she didn't mind. Being unnoticed was familiar. It gave her space to breathe. Her hands were cold, even though the room was warm. She rubbed them together and let her fingers hover over the keys of her keyboard. She didn't play anything yet. She wanted to save her energy for the stage. Still, she let her fingertips rest there for a moment. The plastic keys felt worn out from the years she had practiced on them. The letters printed above some keys had faded. The edges were chipped in places where she tapped too hard during long practice nights. This keyboard had been through everything with her. When she first got it, she had been so small that she needed to sit on a stack of pillows just to reach the keys. It was a used instrument someone from her apartment building gave away, saying it didn't work that well anymore. But to her, it was perfect. She taught herself to play by listening to videos online, tapping the keys again and again until her fingers learned the notes by memory. Most nights, when the world outside was loud or confusing, the keyboard gave her a place to escape. Back in the audition hallway, a volunteer called for the next group of performers. She picked up her keyboard and followed the line, her steps quiet, her back straight. She didn't speak to anyone. She didn't know what she would say, even if she tried. She wasn't here to impress with words. She hoped the music would be enough dot inside the audition room. Everything felt brighter, almost too bright. The lights hit the stage in a way that made her blink a few times. 3 judges sat behind a long table, flipping through papers, whispering to each other, and checking the list of contestants. They looked tired, like they had already been there for hours. She wondered how many performances they had listened to before hers. A staff member motioned her forward. She carried her keyboard to the small stand placed center stage. It was a little loose, wobbling when she adjusted it. She pressed down on each corner until it felt steady enough. The judges didn't pay much attention at first. One of them stretched their neck like they were trying to stay awake. Another tapped a pen rhythmically on the table. She took a breath and stepped closer. "Good morning," one judge said without looking up. "Just something simple, all right? We're moving quickly today." She nodded. That was all they expected of her, something simple, something quick, something they could check off their list before moving on. She didn't argue. There was no point. She wasn't the type to fight for attention. She wasn't here to prove anything with her voice or her confidence. It was the music that mattered. The judge closest to her looked up briefly, glanced at her old keyboard, then back down at their notes. It was clear they didn't expect much. Her worn-out instrument probably looked unimpressive next to the polished guitars and expensive equipment other contestants brought. She sat on a small metal stool. The staff rolled out for her. It squeaked a little under her weight. She pulled it closer to the keyboard, adjusting her posture. She let her hands hover over the keys again. Her fingers trembled not from fear, but from excitement so strong that she had to steady her breathing. She remembered her room at home, small but warm, with posters taped unevenly on the walls and a lamp that flickered sometimes. She remembered late nights tapping out sounds, repeating difficult sections until her fingers ached. She remembered wishing every night that she could play in front of people, someday not for fame, but simply to be heard. On the stage now, she felt that wish returning. Heavy but hopeful dot, she pressed the first key gently. The sound was soft, not loud enough yet. She adjusted the volume knob, making sure the judges could hear. The room fell quiet for a moment. Not completely silent. Someone outside the door dropped something, and somewhere backstage, someone coughed, but quiet enough that her heartbeat sounded too loud in her ears. She wasn't sure what the judges wanted exactly. Their instructions had been simple. Play something easy. But she didn't know how to play halfway. Whenever she touched the keys, she played with everything she had. Music was not something she did casually. It had carried her through loneliness, helped her focus when life felt messy, and filled the small spaces of her world with something bright. She couldn't switch that off, not even for an audition. The judges waited, pens ready. One leaned back in their chair, probably expecting the same basic melody they had heard dozens of times already. Maybe they thought she was a beginner. Maybe they thought she was too young, too quiet, too ordinary. She didn't blame them. She rarely looked like someone who had something powerful inside. She took one more slow breath. Then she placed both hands on the keyboard more firmly. Her shoulders relaxed. Her spine straightened. Her fingers steadied, ready. For a split second, everything in the room paused. She felt it like the whole moment was holding itself still just for her. She didn't start playing yet, but the switch had already flipped inside her. The shy girl who carried her keyboard through the crowded hallway was still there. But she was now joined by the version of herself she only met when she played, the version who felt brave, focused, and connected to something bigger than her fears. She glanced up at the judges briefly. They were still waiting, still unaware of what she was about to do, still assuming this would be quick and simple. She lowered her gaze back to the keys. Her fingers curled slightly. This was it. She didn't know if the judges would like what she played. She didn't know if the audience outside would remember her. But she knew one thing with certainty. She came here to give them the truest version of her music, even if they only expected a small, easy tune. And in that moment, before the first real note left the keyboard, she felt a quiet confidence settle in her chest. Not loud or flashy, just steady. Steady enough to let her begin. She shifted her weight, touched the first chord with intention, and prepared to let everything she had learned, everything she had lived through, flow into the room. Even before she played, something in the air had changed. She could feel it. She hoped the judges would feel it too, soon enough. She didn't begin life with much, but what she did have shaped her more than she realized. Long before she stepped onto that bright stage, her world looked very different. Her story didn't begin with applause or spotlights. It began in a small apartment where music was the only thing that made the days feel lighter. The apartment was tucked into the top floor of an old building, the kind where the elevator often broke down and the paint in the hallway peeled from years of weather and footsteps. Inside their unit, the walls were thin enough that she could hear neighbors talking, laughing, arguing, or dragging furniture across the floor. Her home wasn't always peaceful, but she learned to create her own quiet space through sound. Her parent worked long hours, often leaving early in the morning and returning late at night. Some days she barely saw them. They would pick up extra shifts whenever they could, trying to make ends meet. Money wasn't something they talked about often, but she could feel the strain without being told. She saw it in the tired expression they carried home each night, in the way they sometimes skipped dinner, saying they weren't hungry. She knew they were doing everything they could. Because of those long hours, she spent a lot of time alone. After school, she walked home, let herself into the apartment, and filled the silence however she wanted. At first, She didn't mind the quiet. She would do her homework, eat leftovers, and watch the sunlight stretch across the living room floor as the evening settled in. But after a while, the silence felt heavy. The rooms were small, and the air felt too still. That changed the day she found her first keyboard. Someone in the building had placed it in the hallway, near the trash room. There was a handwritten sign taped to it that said, "Free, doesn't work well." Most people passing by didn't give it a second look. But she stopped. She pressed one key, and even though the sound crackled and faded, it still made her heart jump. She dragged it inside, cleaning it with an old cloth until the dust stopped coming off. Some keys stuck, some didn't play at all, and the power cord was frayed at the ends. Still, it was hers. She didn't know how to play anything yet. She didn't even know where to begin. But she had something new to fill her evenings. She found simple tutorial videos online. She watched people's hands move across the keys, pausing the screen again and again so she could copy the position of their fingers. At first, her notes were uneven and unsure. But she practiced every day, sometimes for hours, sometimes until her back hurt. She didn't think about becoming great at it. She didn't think about performing on a stage someday. She just loved the feeling of trying. Soon, music became the one thing she looked forward to. When school felt stressful, she went home and played. When she felt lonely, she played. When everything around her felt loud or confusing, she played. The keyboard became more than an instrument. It became a companion. There were days when she played so softly that the sound barely filled the room. And there were days when she played as loud as the old speakers would allow, letting her emotions spill through every key she touched. Sometimes she even hummed along, though she didn't think her voice mattered much. Music wasn't something she wanted attention for. It was something she wanted to feel. One evening, her parent came home to find her practicing a simple melody she had finally mastered after weeks of mistakes. They stood quietly in the doorway, watching her fingers move. When she finished, they clapped softly. She turned around, surprised. "That's beautiful," they said with a tired but genuine smile. She didn't hear praise often, so those words stayed with her for a long time. As months passed, she grew better. Her fingers became more confident, her timing more natural. She learned how to move between chords without stumbling. She even started writing small pieces of her own, sounds that reflected whatever she couldn't say out loud. Her parents saved little by little and surprised her on her birthday with a new power cord so the keyboard wouldn't spark when plugged in. It was the biggest gift she had received in years. But life wasn't always smooth. The apartment building had nights when arguments echoed through the halls, and weekends when loud parties kept her awake. There were months when bills piled up and stress filled the air. Through all of it, she kept her keyboard close. She learned to block out the noise around her and focus on the sound. She created. She practiced in the morning before school. She practiced between homework assignments. She practiced late at night when she couldn't sleep. The more she played, the more she felt like she was building something no one could take away. When she entered high school, she carried her passion quietly. She wasn't the type to join big clubs or speak up in class. She preferred to spend lunch breaks in the library or find quiet corners where she could sketch out music notes in her notebook. Most people didn't know she played at all. She never talked about it unless asked. During a school talent show one year, she sat in the audience and watched performers take the stage. She wondered what it would feel like to play in front of people. But she wasn't ready then. She didn't trust her hands not to shake, or her voice not to crack if she had to speak. Still, the idea stayed in the back of her mind. As time passed, her skills grew in ways she didn't even notice. What once took her weeks to learn now took days. She began creating longer pieces, adding emotional rises and smooth transitions. Sometimes Her parent would leave the door slightly open when she played, letting the sound drift into the hallway. Neighbors would pause, listening quietly before continuing on their way. Then came the day the flyer changed everything. It was taped to the grocery store window, a bright poster advertising a local talent competition. Anyone could sign up. All ages, all backgrounds. She stood there staring at it longer than she meant to. The idea of performing felt terrifying. But at the same time, something inside her urged her forward. She didn't sign up right away. She brought the idea home, thinking about it quietly for days. She imagined what it would feel like to stand on stage and let her music speak for her. She imagined the lights, the audience, the judges, all waiting to hear something. The thought made her nervous, but it also made her excited in a way she had never felt before. Finally, one evening after dinner, she filled out the sign-up form. It was simple, just a few lines asking for her name, her instrument, and the type of performance. She hit submit before she could talk herself out of it. As soon as she did, her stomach flipped. Fear rushed in, first fear of failing, fear of embarrassing herself, fear of being judged. But after that came something stronger, hope. A hope she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. She practiced every day after that, not just for the competition, but for herself. She worked on tone, timing, and emotion. She played until her fingertips tingled and her arms felt heavy. But she didn't mind. Every note she played reminded her that she was doing something brave. Her parent noticed, of course. They would sit on the couch sometimes, listening as she repeated the same section over and over. One night they asked, "Are you preparing for something?" She hesitated, then nodded. When she told them about the competition, they looked surprised but proud. They didn't pressure her or offer unrealistic expectations. They simply said, "Give it your best." That's enough. As the audition date approached, she felt her nerves grow. She packed and repacked her keyboard. She tested the power chord again and again. She practiced in front of a mirror, imagining herself on stage. She even rehearsed placing the keyboard on its stand so she wouldn't fumble. She wasn't trying to impress the world. She just wanted to show something real, something true to who she was. The morning she left for the competition, she woke up before sunrise. The sky outside was still dark, and the air felt cool when she stepped out of the building. She carried her keyboard with both hands, walking slowly down the street toward the bus stop. At the bus shelter, a few early commuters waited with tired eyes. She stood quietly, clutching her keyboard. Her mind replayed everything she had practiced. She knew the judges would expect something simple. She knew they would want something quick. But she also knew her music had grown far beyond the simple melodies she once learned. As the bus arrived and she stepped on, she felt a mix of fear and courage swirling inside her. But courage was winning. She wasn't going to that audition to fit expectations. She was going to share a piece of herself. And even though she didn't know it yet, the path she was taking that morning would change her life in ways she never imagined. The door to the audition room closed behind her, and for a brief moment, the noise from the hallway faded away. She stood alone on the stage, facing the judges who barely lifted their eyes when she walked in. It was clear they had already listened to dozens of performers that morning. Their shoulders were slumped, and their voices were low and tired. She didn't take it personally. They didn't know her yet. They didn't know what she carried inside. A staff member pointed at the small stand in the center. She walked toward it, lifting her keyboard carefully, as if it were something fragile. The stand wobbled a little when she set it down, but she adjusted the legs until it felt stable. She checked the power cord twice, making sure it was plugged in properly. Everything around her felt bright and loud, but she tried to keep her focus. One judge finally looked up and gave a half smile. The kind someone gives when they're trying to stay polite, but don't expect much. "All right," the judge said, waving a hand lightly. "Just play something simple. Something short. We're moving quickly today." Their voice wasn't unkind, just tired. She nodded. She didn't tell them she had practiced for hours every day. She didn't tell them the melody she planned to play wasn't simple at all. She didn't tell them the music she brought with her came from years of quiet nights, long days, and moments when music was the only thing that made her world feel bigger. She kept all of that inside. She took a seat on the small stool the staff pushed forward. It creaked under her weight, but she didn't mind. Her heart was beating fast, but not from fear. More from the feeling that something important was about to happen. She wasn't sure what exactly, but her body felt it before her mind did. She rested her fingers lightly on the keys and took a deep breath. Her hands trembled just a little, not from nerves, but from excitement. She wanted this moment to matter. She wanted her music to speak for her. Words often felt too heavy, but sound felt honest. The judges whispered among themselves, barely paying attention. One adjusted the stack of papers in front of them. Another took a sip from a cup of coffee that was already going cold. The third checked a watch, as if counting how much time remained before lunch. She watched them quietly, not offended at all. She knew they had no idea who she was or what she had prepared. In a way, she liked that. There was something freeing about low expectations. It made the moment hers. Her fingers hovered over the keys. She hadn't played a single note yet, but she could feel her entire journey living inside her hands, the old apartment. The lonely evenings, the broken keyboard she found near the trash room, the soft encouragement from her parent, the nights she practiced until the sun began to rise. All of it was there, resting in her fingertips. She pressed the first key. The sound was gentle, almost too soft. She adjusted the volume slightly. The judges barely noticed. They were still waiting for a basic tune, something a beginner might play. She knew they expected nothing more from her. She took another breath, deeper this time. She closed her eyes for half a second and remembered the promise she made to herself the night before, to play honestly, without holding back. She opened her eyes. Then she placed both hands on the keyboard, steadied her shoulders, and prepared to begin. Before she started the real melody, she thought about all the moments that led her here. The smallest ones mattered just as much as the big ones. She remembered sitting on the floor of her apartment with her parent, repairing the old power cord with tape so it would stop sparking. She remembered trying to play softly so the neighbors wouldn't complain. She remembered the first time she felt proud of a chord progression she created by accident. Those memories didn't make her nervous, they made her stronger. But the judges didn't see any of that yet. All they saw was a quiet girl with an old keyboard who had been asked to play something simple. She didn't argue with their instruction. She didn't say she could do more. She had learned long ago that sometimes the best way to show what you're capable of is simply to do it. She waited a moment longer. The room remained still, except for the distant echoes of other contestants waiting outside. Her breathing slowed. Her back straightened. Her mind grew calm. The moment had finally come. But before she pressed the next key, the one that would change everything, the door behind the judges creaked open. A staff member poked their head in, whispering something about the schedule. The judges nodded, but didn't look away from their papers. She waited patiently, letting the interruption pass. When the door closed again, the judges turned their eyes back to her. The one in the middle repeated, "Just something easy, all right? We need to stay on track." She gave a small nod, though inside something very different was forming. She didn't feel angry. In fact, their instruction made her smile a little. If they expected something simple, her performance would surprise them even more. The judges leaned back slightly, ready to listen in the half-hearted way people listen when they've already made up their minds. Her fingertips touched the keys again. She thought of her small apartment, where she practiced every afternoon. She thought of the way her parent always looked relieved when she played something soft and calming after a long day of work. She remembered the nights she sat on her bed, notebook open, trying to write down her own music using shapes instead of proper notes, because she didn't know the right symbols at first. All of that emotion settled quietly inside her when she finally began. The sound didn't burst out, it bloomed slowly, like a sunrise spreading warmth across the sky. It started gentle, almost shy, just like her. But even in the softness, there was depth. Anyone really listening would feel it immediately. First judge stopped tapping their pen. The second judge leaned forward slightly. Third looked up fully for the first time. She didn't notice their reactions yet. She was too focused on the music. She moved her fingers smoothly, letting the melody rise and fall in waves. Each note was connected to something real, something she had lived. What she played was not the simple tune they requested. It was the beginning of a piece she spent years building quietly. A piece that helped her through hard days. A piece she played when she felt unsure about herself. A piece that carried her through both sadness and hope. As she played, her posture changed. She no longer looked nervous or small. Her back straightened naturally, her shoulders relaxed, and her hands glided across the keys as if the instrument had been waiting for her. The judges' expressions shifted without them realizing it. Their tired eyes sharpened. Their posture lifted. Their attention moved from the papers in front of them to the girl they had almost overlooked. She continued, letting the melody grow more complex. The soft beginning turned into something fuller, richer. Her fingers moved faster, then slower, then fast again, shaping the music with confidence she rarely showed in everyday life. Her hair fell slightly over her face as she leaned in, completely absorbed. She didn't hear the faint gasp one of the judges made. She didn't see the way another judge's hand froze halfway to their coffee cup. She didn't know that, for the first time that day. The judges had forgotten the schedule. She only knew the music. She played as though the room were empty, as though she were back in her apartment, alone with her keyboard. But this time, the sound filled a larger space. It echoed off the walls, reaching people who had never heard her play before. She didn't rush. She didn't hold back. She let the melody tell the truth her voice never could. Even though she had been told to play something simple, she let the complexity unfold naturally, not out of rebellion, but out of honesty. This was who she was when she played. This was the truest version of her. As the piece grew more emotional, she felt the familiar warmth in her chest, the feeling she always got when her music connected to her heart. The room around her faded. The judges, the lights, the pressure, all of it disappeared. She played the notes she once struggled with for months. She played the transitions she practiced until her fingers ached. She played the parts she wrote late at night when she couldn't sleep. Every part of her journey was there, woven into the sound, and for the first time since she walked into that room, the judges really listened. One judge leaned forward with elbows on the table. Another kept blinking, trying to process how such a powerful sound was coming from such a quiet girl. The last judge's expression softened completely, eyebrows lifting with surprise. They didn't interrupt her. They didn't whisper. They didn't glance at their watches. They just listened. She didn't know how long she had been playing when the room seemed to hold its breath. She was nearing the part of the piece that always felt the most vulnerable, the moment when the melody dipped into a softer, almost fragile sequence before rising again. She let her fingers slow, letting each note linger. Her heartbeat matched the rhythm, steady and full. Even the air felt still. In that quiet space, She felt something she had never felt before, not fear, not pressure, but a sense of belonging. She belonged on stage. She belonged in that moment. She didn't know how the judges would react yet. She didn't know what score they would give, or whether she would move forward. But she knew something more important. She had given them the real her, and she could feel the room changing already, even if no one had spoken a word yet. The moment she started the real heart of her piece, the air in the room shifted in a way she hadn't felt before. The first section had caught the judges' attention, but now the second section began to pull them in deeper. There was something powerful about the way she played, gentle but full, quiet but alive, steady but emotional. Her fingers told a story she had never spoken out loud. She didn't notice the judges' expressions changing again. She didn't see the way one leaned so far forward that their chair creaked. She didn't see the way another judge stopped breathing for a second, as though afraid of interrupting the sound. All she knew was that her hands were finally doing what they had practiced for years. Her fingertips glided across the keys with a confidence she never allowed herself to show anywhere else. Each movement, each shift, each rising note carried a piece of her past. She remembered the nights she had sat alone on her bedroom floor, humming melodies she wished she knew how to play. She remembered the soft sounds drifting through the apartment when the rest of the building felt too loud. She remembered the moments she felt small, and how music made her feel bigger. All of it lived in the music now. As the melody grew stronger, she felt her whole body relax. Her shoulders lowered, her breath deepened, and her hands moved with an ease that felt almost unreal. Even the lights above her didn't seem so bright anymore. She didn't feel like she was being watched. She felt like she was finally speaking in a language she understood. The judges could sense the shift. They traded glances, silently asking one another if they were hearing what they thought they were hearing. It wasn't just skill. Skill was common. This was something different. This was emotion, timing, expression, and honesty wrapped into one moment. One judge lowered their pen completely, letting it roll off the table and onto the floor. They didn't even bother picking it up. Their eyes were glued to the girl on the stage who had walked in quietly, carrying an old keyboard held together by a taped-up cord. She reached a part of the piece that required extra control. Her hands slowed just enough to make each note ring with intention. It was a delicate moment, one of the sections she had practiced late at night until she almost fell asleep on the keys. If she slipped now, the entire mood would break, but she didn't slip. Her hands moved with perfect steadiness, as though this was the moment she had been waiting for since the day she found her first keyboard in the hallway of her apartment building. For the first time since she stepped on stage, she let herself look up just a little. Not fully, just enough to see the faint shapes of the judges sitting in front of her. What she saw made her pause for half a second. They weren't bored. They weren't distracted. They weren't waiting for her to finish. Their eyes were wide. Their faces were soft and open. Their bodies leaned forward, ready to catch every note she played. Seeing their reactions didn't scare her. It didn't make her freeze. Instead, it filled her with a wave of comfort she didn't expect. She finally knew that they understood the effort she put into this moment. She lifted her chin slightly and returned her focus to the keyboard. Now her movements carried a bit more boldness. She let the next section rise with a sudden push, letting the room feel the strength behind her quiet exterior. Her fingers rolled through quick transitions, hitting each note with certainty. The judges reacted instantly. One put a hand to their chest, another whispered something to the judge beside them. The third simply shook their head, not in disbelief, but in admiration. She didn't know what they were saying, and she didn't want to know. She didn't want anything to break the flow she had worked so hard to build. She continued, letting her music tell the truth. This was the truth. She had learned to play in a small apartment, with peeling wallpaper and a flickering lamp. She had no expensive lessons, no formal teacher guiding her hands. She learned through perseverance, patience, and a deep love for something that made her life feel brighter. And now, that truth echoed through the audition room. The piece grew more intense. Her hands moved faster, dancing across the keys. Her breath matched the pace, steady but full of emotion. She didn't rush, even when the music called for power. She let each note land exactly where it needed to be. The judges could feel the intensity growing. Their expressions changed from surprise to amazement, and then to something closer to awe. They didn't blink. They didn't move. They didn't want to miss a single second. She reached the section that scared her the most, the part where the melody split into two layers, one soft and one sharp. It required precision that had taken her weeks to achieve. She practiced that section late at night, repeating it until she felt she could play it in her sleep. Now, on stage, she didn't overthink it. She trusted her hands. The notes poured out smoothly. The soft layer rose gently, carried by her left hand, while the sharper layer sparkled through her right. It created a sound that filled the room completely, wrapping around the walls and drifting into the spaces the lights couldn't reach. One judge leaned back in their chair, eyes wide, as though they were seeing something unbelievable. Another exhaled slowly, like they had been holding their breath. She didn't let herself look at them again. She kept her focus on the keys until her hands began to slow. The melody softened once more, dipping back into something tender. This was the part of the piece she loved the most, the quiet section that reminded her of home, the section that made her feel peaceful, even when life wasn't easy. Her fingers moved gently, letting the softness linger. Each note fell like a calm breath, filling the air with warmth. Even the harsh stage lights felt softer somehow. She could almost hear her parents' voice in her memory, saying, "That's beautiful," the way they once did when they first heard her play. The room grew still again. No movement. No shifting chairs. No whispered comments from the judges. She could feel them listening. Really listening. She held the last note of the soft section for a moment, letting it fade slowly. Then she prepared herself for the final part. The ending wasn't meant to be loud or sharp. It was meant to be true. Her hands moved in one last rise, a gentle lift of sound that carried everything she felt. Hope, fear, strength, memories. All of it flowed into the final notes. The judges didn't move. They seemed frozen, their eyes fixed on her. When the final note faded, she didn't pull her hands away right away. She kept them on the keys, letting the silence settle. She wanted to hold on to the moment a little longer. Then she lifted her hands slowly. Silence. For a few long seconds, no one spoke. No one shifted. No one even seemed to breathe. The quiet felt heavy, but in the best way. She could feel the room absorbing the last bit of her music. One judge finally blinked. Sitting up straighter, another judge shook their heads slowly. Still in disbelief, the third placed a hand over their mouth. Overwhelmed, she sat there, unsure what to do next. She had never performed for anyone like this before. She didn't know what came after a moment like this. Should she stand? Should she bow? Should she say something? Before she could decide, one of the judges finally spoke. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Their voice was soft, almost careful, as though they were afraid of breaking the spell her music had created. She didn't answer right away. Not because she didn't want to, but because she didn't know how to put her life, her story, and her years of practice into a single sentence. She looked at her old keyboard, the one with the chipped edges and faded letters, the one that had carried her through every moment of growth. Then she looked back up. "At home," she said quietly. The judges exchanged glances again. Their expressions were filled with respect, surprise, and something deeper admiration. She didn't smile yet. She was still catching her breath. One judge leaned forward. "That was not simple," they said with a small laugh that held more emotion than humor. She lowered her gaze, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "I know," she admitted softly. "You didn't just play a piece," another judge said. "You shared something real, something beautiful." She felt her chest warm at those words. She didn't hear compliments often. Hearing them now felt surreal. The judges whispered among themselves for a moment. She sat quietly, waiting. She didn't know what they were deciding. She didn't want to assume anything. Finally, the judge in the middle looked at her again. "You surprised us," they said. "In the best way." "We didn't expect that." She nodded gently. "You're moving forward," the judge said. Without question. Her breath caught for a moment. She had hoped for that result, but hearing it aloud felt like a dream. "Thank you," she said quietly. The words came out small but sincere. As she packed up her keyboard, she realized her hands weren't trembling anymore. They felt steady, warm, and full of life. She had walked into the room thinking. She didn't stand out. She left knowing she had something worth hearing. She stepped out of the audition room with her old keyboard pressed against her chest, still trying to understand everything that had just happened. The hallway felt different, now brighter, quieter, almost like the world had paused for her. She could still hear the echo of the judges' voices in her mind, repeating the words she never expected to hear. "You're moving forward." She walked slowly, almost afraid her legs would give out if she moved too fast. Each step felt strange, like she was floating rather than walking. She reached a bench near the far end of the hallway and sat down softly, placing the keyboard on her lap. For a moment, she simply held it there, feeling the rough edges under her fingertips. This old instrument had been through so much with her. It had been dropped, scratched, taped, and repaired too many times to count. Yet somehow it always came back to life in her hands. She closed her eyes and breathed in deeply. The lights hummed above her. Footsteps echoed far down the hall, and someone's muffled laughter drifted from another room. But none of it touched her. She was somewhere else entirely. She thought back to her first day practicing for the audition. She remembered sitting on the floor of her small living room, trying to decide if she even had a chance. She remembered worrying about what the judges would think of her beat-up keyboard. She remembered wondering if she should even show up. And now she sat here a few minutes after the audition, hearing those words again in her head. "You're moving forward." She opened her eyes slowly and stared down at the keyboard. A small, shy smile began forming at the corner of her mouth. She didn't want to smile too wide, because it felt unreal, but the joy rose inside her like warm sunlight. After a long moment, she stood up again. Her hands felt steady, her steps more confident. She walked toward the exit of the building, where a large glass door showed the world outside. The day looked brighter than earlier. The sky was clear, the sun was warm, and people walked around the streets like it was any normal day. But for her, nothing felt normal. She pushed the door open and stepped outside. The fresh air filled her lungs, and she felt a strange mixture of relief and excitement. She didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in a long time, she felt ready. As she began walking toward the bus stop, she saw a small reflection in a shop window, a reflection of herself holding her keyboard tightly. She looked tired, but she also looked stronger. There was something in her eyes she hadn't seen before. Hope. She reached the bus stop and sat down on the bench, letting her legs rest. A few people stood nearby, busy with their phones or staring into the distance. None of them knew what had just happened. None of them knew how big this moment was for her. She didn't mind. This victory was hers to hold quietly, A gentle breeze passed by, brushing through her hair. She stared at her hands again, thinking about how they had never shaken once while she played. She remembered how calm she felt despite the pressure. It surprised her still. Maybe she was stronger than she ever allowed herself to believe. The bus arrived with a soft rumble. She climbed in, tapped her fare, and found a seat near the back. She held her keyboard upright beside her, as if keeping it safe from the bumps of the ride. As the bus moved, she watched the city pass by outside the window. Buildings, trees, people, traffic, they all blurred into soft shapes. She didn't focus on any of them. Her mind was full of the audition, the judges' expressions, and the music she'd played. She wondered what her next performance would be like. She wondered if she would be able to surprise the judges again. She wondered if she would eventually stand on the big stage, under brighter lights, in front of an audience much larger than the 3 judges she had played for today. The idea made her heart flutter. She imagined a crowd sitting quietly, waiting for her to begin. She imagined the sound of her music filling a huge room. She imagined people clapping for her, smiling, maybe even cheering. The thought scared her a little. It excited her even more. The bus slowed down at her stop, and she stood up carefully, making sure her keyboard didn't bump into anyone. She thanked the driver and stepped out into the sunlight. As she walked down the familiar street toward her apartment building. She couldn't help but feel like everything around her looked different. Like the world had opened a small door just for her. She climbed the stairs to her building, pushed open the old door, and made her way to her apartment. The hallway smelled faintly of laundry detergent and someone's cooking. The walls were still the same faded color, and the lights still flickered sometimes. Nothing had changed here, but she had. When she stepped inside her home, she gently placed her keyboard on the table. She sat down in the same chair where she practiced every night and stared at the small instrument again. For a long time, she didn't move. She just sat there, thinking. She thought about the judges' faces, how surprised they looked, how emotional they seemed. She thought about how she had never imagined someone would react that way to her playing. She leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. Then, without fully realizing she was doing it, she reached forward and turned on the keyboard. The small screen lit up with its usual soft glow. She placed her fingers lightly on the keys. She didn't want to play something complicated. She didn't want to repeat the performance. She just wanted to feel the keys under her hands again. So she played a simple melody, one she used to play when she first learned. The notes were soft and familiar. They reminded her of long nights practicing in silence. They reminded her of all the times she wished she were good enough. Now she knew she was. The melody flowed through the room gently. She kept her eyes closed, letting the sound calm her thoughts. After a few minutes, she lifted her fingers and let the last note fade. She rested her hands in her lap, breathing slowly. The audition had changed everything for her, but it didn't fix all her problems. She still had challenges to face, still had insecurities to work through, still had fears waiting in the background. But now she had something she didn't have before. Proof that she belonged on that stage. Proof that she had something special. Proof that her hard work meant something. She stood up and walked to the small kitchen counter. She poured herself a glass of water and leaned against the counter as she drank it. The cold water felt good after a long day. She wondered what her family would say when she told them. She wondered if they would be proud, if they would believe her right away, or if they would need to see it for themselves. She smiled at the thought of their reactions. She returned to the table and stared at the keyboard again. Tomorrow, she would begin preparing for the next round. She didn't know what song she would choose yet, but she would find something. She always did. For now, though, she allowed herself to simply exist in the moment. She sat back down, placed her elbows on the table, and rested her chin in her hands. She watched the light from the window move slowly across the keyboard dot. It felt like the beginning of something big dot as the afternoon turned into evening. She found herself feeling more hopeful than she had felt in years. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. She knew she would have moments of doubt again. She knew she would have to practice harder than ever, but she wasn't afraid anymore. Her performance that day had shown her something important. She could surprise not only others, but also herself. Outside, the sky slowly shifted to a deeper shade of blue. She turned on the lamp near her table and let its warm light fill the room. The glow made everything feel calm and comfortable. She picked up her phone and opened the message app. Her fingers hovered over the screen for a while. Then she typed a short message. "I made it to the next round?" She hesitated for a moment before sending it. When she finally pressed send, she felt another wave of warmth spread through her chest. A few minutes later, her phone buzzed. "That's amazing. I knew you could do it." She smiled softly. The words felt good. She set her phone down and looked at the keyboard once more. Tomorrow, her journey would continue. But tonight, she allowed herself to rest knowing that, for the first time, she wasn't just hoping for a chance. She had earned it, and she was ready for whatever came next. The night felt unusually quiet, almost as if the air itself was waiting for something to happen. After everything that had unfolded so far, the group moved with a different kind of awareness now. It wasn't fear exactly, but a deeper sense that every step they took mattered. They had come too far, and the road ahead was not just a physical path. It felt like a test. They hadn't fully understood yet. The morning started slow. The sky had a soft gray shade, and the early light spread like a thin mist across the ground. No one spoke much, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was more like each person was gathering their thoughts, sorting through the things they had learned, and preparing themselves for whatever lay ahead. The journey was changing them, even in ways they didn't fully notice. They finally reached a small resting spot by midday. It wasn't marked on any map, and oddly enough, it felt maintained, as if someone had been there recently. A few wooden benches sat in a half-circle around a stone fire pit. The benches looked worn, but stable. One of them walked around slowly, touching the surface of the wood, sensing the presence of whoever once sat there. A gentle breeze moved through the area, and for a moment it felt peaceful, something they hadn't experienced in a long time. They took a moment to rest, stretching their legs, drinking water, and letting the calm sink in. But the peace didn't last long. While they rested, one of them noticed something unusual carved into the stone pit's small lines, forming a pattern. At first glance, it looked random, but when they leaned in closer, the marks formed a familiar shape. It wasn't exactly the same symbol they had found earlier in their journey, but close enough to make their hearts beat faster. None of them said a word. They didn't need to. The message felt clear. They weren't alone on this path, and someone had left this behind for a reason. When they continued forward, the forest around them grew thicker. Trees stood closer together, creating a tunnel-like feeling. Sunlight filtered through in thin stripes, casting long shadows across the ground. Every sound in the distance felt sharper: the rustle of leaves, the crack of a branch, the chirp of birds. Even the wind sounded like it was carrying whispers. As they walked, they came across an old signpost leaning slightly to one side. The wood was darkened from age, and the words carved into it were faded. But they could still make out a few letters, hinting at a path that split in two directions. One path looked well-worn, the kind of route people used often. The other was narrow, covered with overgrown roots and thick plants. It looked untouched, almost hidden. The group stood there, trying to decide which way to go. The worn path felt safer, but the hidden path seemed more likely to lead them where they needed to be. They exchanged glances, and without even needing to talk it out, they stepped toward the hidden path. Something in their instincts told them this was the right direction. Even if it didn't look like it. As they made their way deeper, the trail became harder to follow. Plants brushed against their shoulders, and branches bent under the weight of years without being disturbed. But as rough as it was, something about the path felt strangely intentional, as if it had been left wild on purpose. After a long stretch of walking, the path suddenly opened into a large clearing. The shift was so sudden, it almost felt like stepping into a different world. The ground was smooth, the grass neatly trimmed, and a calm pond sat at the center. Water shimmered in the light, perfectly still, almost reflective like glass. They approached the water slowly, drawn in by the unexpected beauty. The surface of the pond reflected the sky and the trees around them. But when they leaned closer, the reflection seemed to move differently, almost as if something beneath the surface was shifting. One of them reached out and gently tapped the water with their fingertips. Ripples spread outward, and then something odd happened. In the ripples, they saw shapes forming. Not faces, not creatures, but scenes, moments from earlier in their journey. The pond was showing them pieces of their own path. They stared at the water, unsure what to make of it. The images faded after a few seconds, returning the pond to its still, quiet state. None of them spoke right away. They weren't scared, just surprised at how many strange things they were beginning to encounter. Morning of the next round arrived sooner than she expected. She woke up before her alarm, her eyes opening slowly as sunlight slipped through the curtains and stretched across the room. For a moment she lay still, listening to the quiet hum of the city outside and feeling the soft weight of the blankets around her. It was peaceful, calm, almost too calm for a day that meant so much. She turned her head and looked at her keyboard sitting on the table. It waited for her in its usual place, the screen dark, the keys still. She stared at it for a moment, remembering every late night she spent practicing. Every moment she doubted herself. Every time she told herself not to quit. Today was the day she would step onto that stage again. She sat up slowly and stretched her arms. Her body felt a mix of nerves and excitement. She wasn't as scared as before, but she wasn't completely calm either. It wasn't the bad kind of nervousness. It was the kind that told her something important was about to happen. After getting ready, she fixed her hair in the mirror, taking a moment to make sure she looked neat. She didn't try to look fancy. She just wanted to feel like herself. She grabbed her keyboard, holding it carefully, and stepped out of her apartment. The hallway was quiet as she walked toward the exit. She could hear her own footsteps echoing softly. The morning air felt cool when she stepped outside, and she took a deep breath, feeling it fill her lungs. She walked to the bus stop, her steps slow but steady. Cars passed by, people hurried around her, and the city began its usual rush. But she kept her focus on her thoughts, on the music she had chosen for the next round, on the judges' reactions last time, and on the hope that she could surprise them again. When the bus arrived, she climbed in and sat near the window. She held her keyboard close, watching the streets blur past. She could almost hear parts of her song playing in her mind, the notes weaving together gently. She tapped her fingers against the side of the keyboard, practicing the rhythm quietly. The closer she got to the building, the faster her heartbeat grew. She felt her palms warm slightly, but she wiped them on her jeans and took another deep breath. She reminded herself of what she told herself before the first audition. Just play from the heart. The bus reached her stop, and she stepped off, tightening her grip on her instrument. As she walked toward the entrance of the audition hall, she noticed other contestants standing around some, talking to each other nervously. Others practicing little pieces under their breath. Some pacing back and forth. She didn't join any of them. She found a small, quiet corner near the wall and sat down. She placed her keyboard on her lap and ran her fingers gently across the keys without pressing them. She closed her eyes for a moment. She imagined the stage. She imagined the judges. She imagined the lights. She imagined herself playing with the same honesty she played with last time. A staff member called her name, and she opened her eyes. Her heart jumped, but she stood up immediately. She picked up her keyboard and followed them through the hallway. The hallway seemed longer than before. Every step echoed against the walls. She could hear faint music from other rooms, voices from behind doors, distant clapping. It all mixed together into a blur of sound. Finally, the staff member stopped and opened a door. "Wait here," they said kindly. "They'll call you in a moment." She nodded and stepped inside the waiting room. It was smaller than she expected, with a single chair and a dim lamp in the corner. She sat down and placed her keyboard beside her. Resting her hands in her lap, her heart thudded gently, not painfully, just enough to remind her she cared deeply about this moment. After a few minutes, someone knocked on the door. "You're up," the voice said. She stood, picked up her keyboard, and followed them toward the stage entrance. She could hear the last notes of another contestant's performance fading out. She waited on the side until she heard the applause. Then the room went quiet. Voice announced her name. She stepped onto the stage. The lights shone bright once again. The large room stretched out in front of her. The judges sat in their familiar places, but today their expressions were more curious, more expectant. They remembered her. She walked slowly to the center of the stage and placed her keyboard down. She plugged it in carefully, making sure everything worked. Her hands trembled slightly this time, but she exhaled and let the fear pass. When she looked up, one judge smiled softly. "Welcome back," the judge said. She nodded politely. Her voice too quiet to trust, yet another judge leaned forward. "We're excited to hear what you've chosen for this round." She pressed her lips into a small smile and said, "Thank you." Her voice came out calm. She took her seat, adjusted the keyboard, and placed her fingers gently on the keys. The room fell silent. She began to play. The first note she played was soft, enough to barely float through the air, but clear enough to settle gently in the room. It carried a warmth, a tenderness, something delicate that caught the judge's attention immediately. Her fingers moved slowly at first, tracing the melody she had spent hours mastering. It wasn't a loud piece, and it wasn't designed to impress with speed. It was meant to show soul, something she had plenty of. The melody flowed like a quiet river,